At my husband's work anniversary party, I heard him introduce his ex-girlfriend to his colleagues as the love of his life. When someone asked about me, he said, "Oh, that's just my wife." I stood there with our daughter in my arms, realizing my entire marriage was a lie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hi, my name is Elena Martinez, and I am 36 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. For the past 11 years, I have been married to a man I believed was my partner, my best friend, and the person who chose me above all others. His name is David Chun, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly who he was and what our marriage meant. I was wrong about everything. The discovery that shattered my world happened on a Friday evening in late September. David's company was celebrating its 15th anniversary, and they had organized an elegant reception at one of Charlotte's upscale hotel ballrooms. The event was a big deal for David, who had been with the company for 8 years and had recently been promoted to regional sales director. He had been talking about this celebration for weeks, emphasizing how important it was for me to attend because his superiors, colleagues, and major clients would all be present. I had taken the afternoon off from work to prepare for the evening. Our daughter, Sophie, who is 4 years old, was supposed to stay with my mother for the night, but my mother called that afternoon to say she was feeling unwell and could not babysit. David seemed disappointed when I told him, but he quickly suggested that we bring Sophie along to the party. The invitation had specified that the event was family-friendly, and there would be a designated children's area with supervision and activities. I agreed, thinking it would actually be nice for Sophie to see where her father worked and meet some of the people he talked about so frequently. We arrived at the hotel around 6:30 in the evening. The ballroom was beautifully decorated with the company's colors, and a jazz quartet played sophisticated music in one corner. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and the atmosphere felt celebratory and professional. David immediately began networking, introducing me to various colleagues and clients as we moved through the crowd. He seemed energized and confident, clearly in his element at this type of professional gathering. Sophie was initially shy, clinging to my leg as we navigated through the sea of adults in formal attire. After about 20 minutes, I took her to the children's area, which was set up in an adjacent room with games, activities, and 2 professional childcare workers supervising about a dozen other children. Sophie seemed comfortable once she saw the other kids, and I felt confident leaving her there while I returned to the main reception to support David during his important evening. When I returned to the ballroom, I could not immediately locate David in the crowd. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and began walking slowly around the perimeter of the room, scanning for my husband's familiar figure. The ballroom was quite large, and various clusters of people had formed throughout the space, engaged in animated conversation. I finally spotted David near the far corner of the room, standing with a group of 4 people I did not recognize. He was laughing at something someone had said, his expression more animated than I had seen in months. As I began walking toward the group, intending to join my husband, I noticed that one of the people in the circle was a woman around my age with striking auburn hair, wearing an elegant emerald green dress. Something about the way she stood near David, the familiarity in her body language, made me slow my approach. I was perhaps 15 feet away, close enough to hear their conversation but partially obscured by a decorative column, when I heard David's voice clearly above the ambient noise of the party. He was gesturing toward the auburn-haired woman as he spoke to the other people in the group. "This is Rebecca," David said, his voice carrying unmistakable warmth and something I can only describe as reverence. "She's the love of my life. We actually dated for 5 years before life took us in different directions." I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I stood frozen, unable to process what I had just heard my husband say about another woman at his company party, where I was supposedly present as his spouse and partner. One of the men in the group, who I would later learn was David's colleague Marcus, laughed and said something I could not quite hear. Then he gestured vaguely in my direction and asked, "So who's that woman I saw you come in with? The one with the little girl?" David turned slightly, following Marcus's gesture, and his eyes landed on me standing partially behind the column. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps concern, but it passed so quickly I almost thought I had imagined it. Then he turned back to the group with a casual shrug. "Oh, that's just my wife," he said, his tone completely devoid of the warmth he had used to describe Rebecca moments earlier. "And our daughter. Just my wife." The words echoed in my mind like a prison sentence. Not "that's Elena, the woman I love," or "that's my wife, my partner," or even simply "that's my wife, Elena." Just my wife. As though I were an accessory, an afterthought, a necessary but unremarkable fixture in his life that warranted no further explanation or enthusiasm. I stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, watching my husband continue his animated conversation with this group that included the woman he had just identified as the love of his life. Rebecca laughed at something else David said, touching his arm briefly in a gesture that suggested long familiarity. The other colleagues in the group seemed completely comfortable with this dynamic, asking Rebecca questions about her career and her connection to David. My mind raced through our entire relationship in those frozen moments. David and I had met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. I had been immediately drawn to his confidence and humor, and he had pursued me persistently after that initial meeting. Our courtship had felt romantic and deliberate. He had proposed after dating for 14 months, presenting me with a beautiful ring during a weekend trip to the mountains. Our wedding had been lovely, attended by friends and family who celebrated what everyone agreed was a perfect match. The early years of our marriage had been happy, or so I had believed. We had supported each other's careers, traveled together, built a home, and eventually welcomed Sophie into our lives. There had been challenges, certainly. Financial pressures when we bought our house, stress during my difficult pregnancy, the exhaustion of new parenthood. But I had always believed we were a team working through life's obstacles together. Had I been blind? Had there been signs I missed or chose to ignore? I thought about the times David had seemed distant or distracted, which I had attributed to work stress. I thought about the occasions when he had been less affectionate or engaged, which I had rationalized as normal ebbs in a long-term relationship. I thought about the moments when I had felt lonely even in his presence, which I had dismissed as my own insecurity or exhaustion from managing career and motherhood. Standing in that ballroom, listening to my husband describe another woman as the love of his life while reducing me to just my wife. All those rationalized moments suddenly crystallized into a devastating pattern I could no longer deny. I had been settling for scraps of affection and attention while believing I had a full marriage. I had been grateful for basic consideration while deserving genuine love and partnership. My paralysis finally broke, and I felt my legs begin to move. I turned away from the scene, walking quickly toward the exit, needing to escape before I broke down completely in front of hundreds of David's colleagues and clients. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall in this public space. My breathing became shallow and rapid as panic and humiliation crashed over me in waves. I found myself in the hotel corridor outside the ballroom, leaning against the wall, trying to regulate my breathing and process what had just happened. Several people passed by, glancing at me with concern, but I could not form words to explain or reassure them. How could I explain that I had just discovered my marriage was built on a foundation I had never seen, never understood, and apparently had no part in constructing? After perhaps 5 minutes, I remembered Sophie. My daughter was in the children's room happily playing, unaware that her mother's world had just collapsed. The thought of Sophie gave me enough focus to push away from the wall and compose myself. I walked to the restroom and stood at the sink, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same as I had an hour ago. Same careful makeup, same navy blue dress I had selected specifically because David had once mentioned he liked me in that color. Same pearl earrings that had been his anniversary gift to me 2 years earlier. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. I splashed cold water on my wrists, a technique I had learned years ago for managing anxiety. I took several deep breaths, practicing the square breathing method a therapist had taught me during a particularly stressful period at work. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. Repeat. The physical technique helped calm my racing thoughts enough to formulate a plan for the immediate future. I could not leave the party immediately because Sophie was comfortable and cared for in the children's room, and removing her abruptly might frighten her. I could not confront David in this public setting because the scene would be humiliating for both of us and potentially damaging to his career. which would ultimately affect our family's financial stability. I needed to get through the next few hours with enough composure to protect my daughter from witnessing her parents' marriage implode in real time. I returned to the ballroom after repairing my makeup and straightening my dress. I deliberately avoided the area where David had been standing with Rebecca and the other colleagues. Instead, I found a quiet corner near the windows overlooking the city and stood there, appearing to observe the view while actually trying to maintain my fragile composure. About 20 minutes later, David found me. He approached with his usual smile, holding 2 glasses of champagne, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned about what I might have overheard. He handed me one of the glasses and stood beside me, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. "Great party, right?" he said, his tone casual and light. "Some really important clients are here. This is exactly the kind of visibility that leads to bigger opportunities." I looked at him, this man I had shared a bed with for 11 years, whose child I had carried and delivered, whose life I had intertwined with mine in 1,000 legal and practical ways. I looked at him and saw a stranger. How had I never noticed that when he looked at me? His eyes held nothing like the warmth I had heard in his voice when he spoke about Rebecca. How had I convinced myself that his moderate affection represented love rather than settling? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Who is Rebecca?" I asked quietly, proud that my voice remained steady despite the storm inside me. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something flickered behind his eyes, caution perhaps or calculation. Then he smiled, a practiced smile that suddenly looked performative rather than genuine. "Rebecca? She's an old friend who works for one of our partner companies. Why do you ask?" "I heard you talking about her," I said, still keeping my voice low and controlled. "I heard you tell people she's the love of your life." For a moment David said nothing. He took a sip of his champagne, his gaze fixed on the skyline rather than on me. When he finally spoke, his tone was dismissive, almost patronizing. "Elena, you're taking something completely out of context. Rebecca and I dated a long time ago, back in college and for a few years after. We were young. It was intense the way college relationships are. I was just being nostalgic and probably exaggerating for storytelling effect. You know how people talk at these things." "And what about me?" I asked. "When someone asked who I was, you said, 'That's just my wife.' Just your wife. Like I'm an afterthought. Like I'm some obligation you tolerate rather than a person you chose and committed to." David sighed. A sound of impatience rather than remorse. "You're being oversensitive. Of course you're my wife. That's what I called you. I don't understand why you're upset about me stating a basic fact." The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting to my intelligence, that I felt a spark of anger cut through the pain and shock. He was not apologizing or explaining. He was not acknowledging that his words might have been hurtful, or that his tone had revealed something significant about his feelings. He was dismissing my entirely reasonable response to his devastating commentary about our marriage. "The way you said it mattered, David," I replied, my voice hardening slightly. "The difference between how you described her and how you described me was impossible to miss. You introduced her with reverence and love. You dismissed me as if I barely merited acknowledgement." "This is not the time or place for this conversation," David said, his tone shifting from dismissive to stern. "I have important people here tonight. We can discuss your feelings later. But right now I need you to smile and play the supportive wife role. Can you do that? Or are you going to make a scene?" The request, no, the demand, that I perform the role of supportive wife immediately after discovering he considered another woman the love of his life was so absurd, so insulting that I almost laughed. But there was nothing funny about this situation. I was trapped at this party with my daughter in the next room, facing the reality that my marriage was a performance I had been giving for an audience of one who was not even watching. "I am not making a scene," I said quietly. "But I am also not going to pretend everything is fine. I am going to check on Sophie and then we are leaving." "Elena, be reasonable," David began, but I walked away before he could finish his sentence. I had spent enough years being reasonable, being accommodating, being understanding. I had been so busy being everything I thought a good wife should be that I had never noticed my husband did not see me as the love of his life. I had been just his wife probably since the beginning, and I had been too invested in the fantasy to recognize the reality. I collected Sophie from the children's room, thanking the caregivers and explaining that we needed to leave early due to a family matter. Sophie was disappointed to leave the games and new friends, but she accepted my explanation without much protest. I texted David that I was taking our daughter home, and that he should find his own transportation back from the party. During the drive home, Sophie chattered in the back seat about the activities she had enjoyed and the other children she had met. I responded with appropriate sounds and brief comments, functioning on autopilot while my mind processed the evening's revelations. By the time we arrived home, Sophie was drowsy. I carried her inside, helped her into pajamas, and tucked her into bed with minimal resistance since she was exhausted from the excitement. Once Sophie was asleep, I sat in our living room in the dark, waiting. I did not turn on lights. I did not turn on the television. I simply sat in the chair by the window and waited for my husband to come home, so we could have the conversation that would determine the future of our marriage and our family. David arrived home around 11:30. He walked into the dark house, turned on the hallway light, and seemed surprised to find me sitting in the living room chair. He loosened his tie and set down his briefcase, his movement suggesting he hoped I had already gone to bed and the confrontation could be delayed. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "Can this wait until morning?" David asked, exhaustion evident in his tone. "It has been a long evening and I am tired." "No, it cannot wait. Sit down." Something in my voice must have communicated that I was beyond accommodation because David sat on the couch across from my chair. We faced each other in the dim light from the hallway, and the physical distance between us felt symbolic of the emotional chasm I had only just discovered. "Tell me about Rebecca," I said. "Tell me the truth about who she is and what she means to you." David was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back against the couch cushions and closed his eyes, as though gathering courage or calculating his response. When he opened his eyes and began speaking, his voice held a resignation that confirmed my worst fears. "Rebecca and I dated from sophomore year of college through our mid-20s. We were together for almost 6 years. We talked about marriage, about building a life together. She is incredible. Smart, ambitious, creative, spontaneous. Being with her felt electric. But we wanted different things professionally. She got accepted to a graduate program in California, and I had a job opportunity here in Charlotte. We tried long distance for a few months, but it did not work. We broke up and she moved to California. It was the hardest thing I ever went through." Each word felt like a physical blow. I sat motionless, forcing myself to listen, to hear the truth I had been denied throughout our entire marriage. "A few years after Rebecca and I broke up, I met you," David continued. "You were nice, stable, easy to be with. We had common interests and compatible life goals. My mother loved you immediately, which mattered more than I probably admitted. You seemed like the kind of person who would make a good partner, a good mother. So I pursued a relationship with you and it was fine. Comfortable. I thought maybe comfort and compatibility were more important than passion. I thought maybe I needed to grow up and choose the sensible option instead of chasing the fireworks. I wanted him to stop talking, but I also needed to hear everything. I needed to understand exactly how thoroughly I had been deceived, exactly how little I had actually mattered to the man I had married. When I proposed to you, I genuinely believed I was making the right choice," David said. "I cared about you. I respected you. I thought that was enough to build a marriage on. And for a while it was okay. We built a nice life. We had Sophie, who I love more than anything. But I never stopped thinking about Rebecca. I never stopped wondering what my life would have been like if we had found a way to make it work." "Why did you marry me if you were still in love with someone else?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly despite my efforts to maintain composure. "Because Rebecca was gone," David said simply. "She had moved on with her life. I had not heard from her in years. Marrying you seemed like moving forward, accepting reality. I thought eventually my feelings for Rebecca would fade, that I would grow into loving you the way I loved her. I did try, Elena. I really did." The past tense was not lost on me. He had tried. Past tense. Meaning at some point, he had stopped trying to love me and had simply coasted on the momentum of our established life together. "When did Rebecca come back into your life?" I asked, already knowing the answer would hurt. About 8 months ago, David admitted. She moved back to Charlotte for work. We reconnected at an industry conference. We have been rebuilding our friendship. Nothing physical has happened, he added quickly, though I had not asked. But yes, seeing her again reminded me of what I settled for when I chose stability over passion. Settled for. He had settled for me. Our entire marriage, the life we had built, the daughter we had created together. All of it had been David settling for second best while pining for the woman he actually wanted. And I had been completely oblivious to my role as the consolation prize in my own life. I want you to leave, I said quietly. Pack a bag tonight and find somewhere else to stay. We will figure out the logistics tomorrow, but I cannot have you here right now. Elena, let's not be hasty, David began, but I cut him off. You introduced another woman as the love of your life at your work party, while I stood there with our daughter. You told me tonight that you settled for me, that you never stopped loving her, that you tried and failed to grow into loving me. There is nothing hasty about this decision. You destroyed our marriage tonight by telling me truths you should have either never acted on or disclosed 11 years ago. Now pack a bag and leave. David must have recognized that argument was futile because he stood without further protest and walked upstairs to our bedroom. I heard him moving around, opening drawers in the closet. 15 minutes later, he came back downstairs carrying a duffel bag in his laptop case. He paused at the door, looking back at me still sitting in the dark living room. I am sorry I hurt you, Elena. I really am. You deserve better than this. Yes, I do, I agreed. I deserved better than this 11 years ago when you asked me to marry you while in love with someone else. I deserved better than this 4 years ago when we were creating our daughter. I deserved better than this 8 months ago when Rebecca moved back into your life, and you decided to rebuild a connection with her while still married to me. And I deserve better now than watching you walk out this door feeling sorry that you got caught, but not sorry enough that you were actually willing to work on genuinely building a life with me. David had nothing to say to that. He opened the door and left, pulling it closed quietly behind him out of consideration for Sophie sleeping upstairs. I heard his car start in the driveway and listened as the engine noise faded into the distance. Only then, alone in my dark house with my daughter sleeping upstairs, did I finally allow myself to break down. The tears I had held back all evening flooded out in great wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the marriage I thought I had. I cried for the love I thought I had earned through years of partnership and devotion. I cried for my daughter, who would grow up in a divided home because her father had been too cowardly to be honest before making permanent commitments. And I cried for myself, for the woman who had tried so hard to be enough for someone who had decided before they even met that she would never measure up to a memory. I cried until I had no tears left, until my body was exhausted and my mind was numb. Then I sat in that dark room until the first hints of dawn began lightening the sky outside my window. I sat there and began planning what came next, because I had a daughter who needed me to be strong in a life that needed to be rebuilt from the ruins of false foundations. The story of how I discovered my husband's betrayal was only the beginning. What came next would test everything I thought I knew about myself, my strength, and my capacity to rebuild a life I had never imagined needing to create. But in that moment, watching the sun rise on the first day of my new reality, I made myself a promise that I would never again accept being someone's second choice, their consolation prize. They're just my wife. I deserve to be someone's love of their life, and if that person could not be David, then I would learn to be that person for myself and for my daughter. The journey ahead would be difficult, painful, and uncertain. But it would be honest, and after 11 years of living a lie I had not even known I was telling, honesty felt like the only foundation worth building on. The morning after David left, I woke up on the living room couch where I had eventually fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion around 5 in the morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I thought perhaps the previous evening had been a nightmare. Then reality crashed back with crushing weight as I noticed David's reading glasses still sitting on the side table where he always left them. A mundane reminder that he was gone, but his presence still haunted every corner of our home. I heard Sophie's footsteps padding down the stairs, and I quickly sat up, running my hands through my disheveled hair and trying to compose my face into something that would not frighten my 4-year-old daughter. Sophie appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pajamas with cartoon butterflies, clutching the stuffed rabbit she had slept with since infancy. "Mommy, why are you sleeping on the couch?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "Where's Daddy?" The question I had been dreading hit me squarely in the chest. I had no script prepared, no carefully worded explanation that would make sense to a child who had gone to bed in a household with two parents and woken up to find one missing. I patted the couch cushion beside me, and Sophie climbed up, snuggling into my side with the unconscious trust that children have in their parents to make everything okay. "Daddy had to go stay somewhere else for a little while," I said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate caution. "Mommy and Daddy are having some grown-up problems that we need to work on, but it has nothing to do with you. We both love you very much, and that will never change." Sophie processed this information with the seriousness that children sometimes display when confronted with changes they do not fully understand but instinctively recognize as significant. "Is Daddy coming back?" she asked. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," I answered honestly, because I had learned long ago that children can sense dishonesty even when they cannot articulate why something feels false. "Right now we are figuring things out. But no matter what happens, you will always have both your mommy and your daddy who love you." Sophie seemed to accept this explanation, at least for the moment. She asked if she could watch her favorite morning cartoons, and I agreed, grateful for the distraction that would give me time to shower and attempt to gather my thoughts into something resembling a coherent plan for the day ahead. Standing under the hot water in the shower, I allowed myself a few more tears, but they were different from the previous night's wrenching sobs. These tears felt more like a release, a physical purging of the immediate shock that had paralyzed me. As the water washed them away, I felt something unexpected beginning to form beneath the pain and betrayal. It was anger, clean and clarifying, at the years I had wasted trying to be enough for someone who had decided before we even began that I would never measure up to his idealized memory of another woman. I had spent 11 years being a devoted partner, supporting David's career advancement, managing our household, bearing and raising his child, accommodating his preferences and priorities. I had sublimated my own ambitions at times when his career demanded relocations or extra hours that meant I needed to handle more of the domestic responsibilities. I had been loyal, faithful, considerate, and present in ways that apparently had mattered not at all because I had committed the unforgivable sin of not being Rebecca. The anger felt productive rather than destructive. It gave me energy and focus that the grief and shock had drained away. I got dressed in comfortable clothes, went downstairs and made breakfast for Sophie and myself. We ate together at the kitchen table, and I watched my daughter's innocent enjoyment of her pancakes with a fierce determination that she would not suffer any more than absolutely necessary from her father's failures and my necessary response to them. After breakfast, I settled Sophie with her toys in the living room and went to my home office, closing the door for privacy. I needed to begin taking concrete steps to protect myself and my daughter, and that meant consulting with professionals who could guide me through the legal and financial complexities of ending a marriage. My first call was to my closest friend, Jennifer, who had been my roommate in college and remained one of the few people I trusted completely. Jennifer answered on the second ring, and I could hear the concern in her voice immediately. "Elena, I was just thinking about you. How was David's party last night?" The question opened the floodgates, and I found myself recounting the entire devastating evening, in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in their urgency to escape. Jennifer listened without interruption, and when I finally finished, there was a moment of silence before she spoke. "That absolute bastard," Jennifer said with satisfying vehemence. "Elena, I am so sorry. I cannot believe he has been lying to you for your entire marriage. What are you going to do?" "I need a divorce attorney," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded saying those words out loud for the first time. "I need someone who specializes in family law, and who will fight for Sophie's interests and my financial security. Do you know anyone?" Jennifer did. She had gone through her own divorce 3 years earlier, and had worked with an attorney named Patricia Reeves who she described as brilliant, compassionate, and absolutely ruthless when protecting her clients' interests. Jennifer texted me Patricia's contact information immediately, and I called the law office as soon as we ended our conversation. Patricia Reeves had an opening that afternoon due to a cancellation, and I arranged for my mother to watch Sophie for a few hours despite still feeling unwell. My mother had asked questions about why I needed childcare on a Saturday, and I had given her an abbreviated version of the previous night's events. Her response had been immediate fury on my behalf, and an insistence that she was well enough to watch her granddaughter while I took care of necessary business. Patricia Reeves's office was located in a modern building in downtown Charlotte, and the reception area conveyed professional competence without ostentatious luxury. I was shown into Patricia's office promptly at 2 o'clock, and I found myself facing a woman in her early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of focused attention that made me feel immediately that I was being taken seriously. I recounted the story again, this time providing more detail about our financial situation, our assets, David's income and career trajectory, and my own professional background. Patricia took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she was processing information strategically, rather than just sympathetically. When I finished, Patricia set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Elena, I want you to understand several things very clearly. First, what your husband did was emotionally devastating, and you have every right to feel betrayed and angry. Second, from a legal standpoint, emotional infidelity is harder to prove and address than physical infidelity, but North Carolina law does allow for divorce on grounds of emotional abandonment, and we can certainly pursue that angle. Third, you have significant leverage in this situation because you have been the primary caretaker for your daughter, you have your own income and career, and your husband's admission that he married you while in love with someone else demonstrates a fundamental fraud in the marriage foundation." Patricia continued explaining the divorce process in North Carolina, the typical timeline, the factors that would influence custody arrangements and asset division, and the various strategies we could employ depending on how cooperative or contentious David chose to be. She asked detailed questions about our financial accounts, property ownership, retirement savings, debts, and other matters I had honestly never paid much attention to because I had trusted that David and I were building a shared future. That realization struck me forcefully during the consultation. I had been so confident in our partnership that I had not maintained the kind of independent financial awareness that would have protected me if the partnership dissolved. I knew the general state of our finances certainly, but David had handled most of the detailed management because he enjoyed that kind of analysis and planning. I had trusted him to act in our shared interests, never imagining that he might view our marriage as a temporary arrangement that could end when his true love returned to his life. Patricia must have seen something in my expression because she leaned forward slightly and spoke with quiet intensity. "Elena, many women find themselves in exactly this position when their marriages end. You trusted your partner, which is what you are supposed to do in a marriage. The fact that your trust was misplaced does not reflect poorly on you. It reflects poorly on him. But moving forward, you need to become very familiar with every aspect of your financial situation because knowledge is power in divorce proceedings." I left Patricia's office 3 hours later with a retainer agreement signed, a comprehensive checklist of documents and information I needed to gather, and a clearer understanding of the road ahead. The process would likely take at least 6 months, possibly longer depending on how willing David was to negotiate fairly. Patricia would file the initial divorce papers within the week, and David would be served with notice that I was proceeding with legal dissolution of our marriage. Driving home from the attorney's office, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was continued grief over the loss of what I had believed my marriage to be. There was anxiety about the uncertain future and the impact on Sophie. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment in taking concrete actions to protect myself and my daughter rather than remaining paralyzed by shock and betrayal. When I picked up Sophie from my mother's house, my mother pulled me aside while Sophie gathered her toys. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Elena?" she asked, her expression concerned. "Divorce is so final. Maybe counseling could help David recognize what he is throwing away." The suggestion that I should fight for a man who had explicitly told me he settled for me and never stopped loving another woman struck me as so absurd that I almost laughed. But I understood my mother's question came from a generation and mindset that viewed divorce as failure and encouraged women to work harder to save their marriages regardless of the circumstances. "Mom, David told me directly that he married me while in love with Rebecca, that he has been in contact with her for 8 months without telling me, and that seeing her again reminded him that he settled for me. There is no counseling that can fix that level of fundamental dishonesty and disrespect. I deserve better than spending the rest of my life trying to compete with an idealized memory in my own husband's heart." My mother looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You are right. I am sorry. I suppose I just hate seeing you go through this pain. But you do deserve better. You deserve someone who chooses you first, not someone who treats you like a consolation prize. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, I began going through our home office files to gather the financial documentation Patricia had requested. Bank statements, investment account summaries, mortgage documents, credit card statements, tax returns from the past several years, titles to our vehicles, and various other papers that represented the practical scaffolding of our shared life. As I organized these documents, I found myself looking at our financial history with new eyes. I could see the patterns of my own earnings being consistently deposited and often used for household expenses, while David's higher income had been directed more toward investments and retirement accounts that were technically joint, but that he managed exclusively. I could see credit card statements showing purchases I had not made and did not recognize, likely gifts for colleagues or perhaps for Rebecca herself during their 8 months of renewed contact. The discovery of these financial details made me grateful that I had my own career and income. I was not financially dependent on David in the way that would have made leaving truly difficult or impossible. My salary as a senior financial analyst was substantial enough that I could maintain our home and support Sophie if necessary, though the loss of David's income would certainly require budget adjustments. But I had options, and options meant freedom to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was financially mandatory. I spent the next several days moving through a fog of necessary tasks, while processing the emotional devastation in whatever private moments I could find. I went to work on Monday and performed my job with competence that surprised me given my inner turmoil. I took Sophie to her preschool and picked her up each afternoon, maintaining routines that gave her stability even as everything else in our lives was shifting. I cooked meals, did laundry, paid bills, and managed all the ordinary tasks of daily life while simultaneously gathering evidence for divorce proceedings and beginning to envision a future radically different from the one I had planned. David called several times during those first few days, but I did not answer. He sent text messages that alternated between apologetic and defensive, explaining that he had not meant to hurt me, that I was overreacting, that we should talk before making any permanent decisions, that he had a right to have friends regardless of their history together. I did not respond to these messages because anything I might have said would have been either too cruel or too vulnerable, and I was not ready for either extreme. On Wednesday evening, exactly 5 days after the party that had shattered my illusions, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Elena? This is Rebecca Walsh. I think we need to talk. The sound of her voice, cultured and confident, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. This was the woman David had called the love of his life. This was the woman whose memory I had been competing against unknowingly for 11 years. This was the woman whose return to Charlotte had reminded my husband that he had settled for less than what he truly wanted. I have nothing to say to you, I replied, my voice cold and controlled despite my racing heart. Please just give me 5 minutes, Rebecca said. I know you have no reason to trust me or want to hear from me, but there are things you need to know about the situation. Things David probably has not told you. Every instinct told me to hang up immediately, to refuse engagement with the woman who represented everything I was not and could never be in David's eyes. But curiosity and a desperate need to understand how thoroughly I had been deceived made me stay on the line. You have 5 minutes, I said. Start talking. Rebecca took a breath I could hear across the phone connection, then began speaking in a rush of words that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation or at least thought carefully about what she needed to say. I did not know David was married when we reconnected at that industry conference 8 months ago. He was not wearing a wedding ring, and when I asked about his life, he told me he was single and focused on his career. We started meeting for coffee and lunch occasionally, catching up on the years we had been apart. The conversations were nostalgic and friendly, and yes, there was still chemistry between us. But I genuinely believed he was available. I felt sick listening to this, imagining David deliberately removing his wedding ring and lying by omission about his entire married life while rebuilding a connection with the woman he actually loved. The betrayal went even deeper than I had initially understood. I did not learn David was married until about 3 weeks ago, Rebecca continued. Someone at my company mentioned seeing him at a restaurant with his wife and daughter, and I was completely shocked. I confronted him immediately. and he admitted that he had been married for 11 years and had a 4-year-old daughter. He told me that his marriage was essentially a mistake, that he had married you because I was not available and he thought he should settle down, but that he never stopped loving me. The clinical recitation of David's betrayal in Rebecca's voice made it somehow more real and more painful than hearing it from David himself. This was confirmation from an outside source that my entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies and false premises. I told David that I could not continue any kind of relationship with him while he was married and lying to his wife, Rebecca said. I told him he needed to be honest with you and make a real decision about what he wanted rather than trying to maintain both relationships through deception. That is why he brought me to that party. He told me he was going to introduce me to his colleagues as his girlfriend and tell you he wanted a divorce. He said bringing me to a public event would force the issue and prevent him from backing out of being honest. The calculated cruelty of that plan took my breath away. David had orchestrated that entire evening, bringing both me and Rebecca to his company party, planning to humiliate me publicly while declaring his real feelings for the woman he actually loved. The only thing that had deviated from his plan was that I had overheard his introduction of Rebecca before he had intended me to, allowing me to take control of the situation rather than being ambushed according to his timeline. I want you to know that when I understood what he had planned, I left the party immediately, Rebecca continued. I have not spoken to David since that night. What he did to you was cruel and cowardly, and I want no part of it. I am calling because I thought you deserved to know the full extent of his deception, and also because I wanted you to understand that I did not knowingly participate in an affair or in humiliating you. I was misled as well, though obviously my situation is nothing compared to yours. I sat in silence for a moment, processing this information. Rebecca had been lied to as well, though her position was infinitely less sympathetic than mine given that she had been engaging in an emotional affair with a married man even if she had not known his married status. But her willingness to call me and provide information that David would never have voluntarily shared suggested a level of integrity that David clearly lacked. Thank you for telling me this, I said finally. I appreciate you calling, even though this conversation has been incredibly painful. I am filing for divorce, and this information will be useful in those proceedings. I am truly sorry for the pain you are experiencing, Rebecca said, and she sounded genuine. For what it is worth, I think you are better off without him. Anyone who could deceive their wife for 11 years and plan such a calculated public humiliation is not someone worth building a life with. After we ended the call, I sat holding my phone and staring at nothing, trying to absorb this new layer of betrayal. David had not simply fallen back in love with Rebecca when she returned to Charlotte. He had actively pursued rebuilding their relationship through deliberate lies, removing his wedding ring, hiding his family's existence, and cultivating a connection based entirely on false premises. He had then planned to humiliate me publicly at his company party as a way of forcing himself to finally be honest about wanting to end our marriage. The sheer premeditation of his cruelty was almost more devastating than the original discovery of his feelings for Rebecca. This was not a man who had made mistakes or struggled with complicated emotions. This was a man who had calculated every move to serve his own desires, while showing complete disregard for the woman who had committed her life to building a partnership with him. I forwarded Rebecca's contact information to Patricia Reeves with a brief explanation of our conversation, and a request that she reach out to Rebecca for a formal statement that could be used in divorce proceedings if necessary. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in my dark living room just as I had done 5 nights earlier, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything I had lost and everything I would need to rebuild. But beneath the grief and betrayal, that spark of anger continued to burn. I had been wronged profoundly by someone who had promised to love and honor me. My daughter had been brought into a family built on lies and false foundations. Years of my life had been spent investing in a partnership that had been one-sided from its very inception. That anger would fuel me through what came next. It would give me strength when grief threatened to paralyze me. It would remind me that I deserved justice and dignity, not just acceptance of whatever scraps David was willing to offer in settlement negotiations. I had been just his wife for 11 years. But I would not be just the ex-wife, who accepted less than I was entitled to simply to make the divorce process easier for the man who had destroyed our marriage. I would fight for myself and for Sophie with every resource I possessed. I would emerge from this devastation stronger and more whole than I had been in a marriage built on lies. And I would never again accept being anyone's second choice or consolation prize. The journey ahead would test me in ways I could not yet imagine, but I was ready to begin. The week following my conversation with Rebecca marked a turning point in how I approached the dissolution of my marriage. The initial shock and paralysis had given way to focused determination, and I channeled all my analytical skills honed through years of financial work into systematically documenting every aspect of David's deception and our marital assets. Patricia Reeves had emphasized during our initial consultation that divorce proceedings often favored the spouse who came prepared with comprehensive documentation, and I intended to be meticulously prepared. I began by creating a detailed timeline of events, starting from when Rebecca had moved back to Charlotte 8 months earlier, and extending through the company party 5 days ago. I documented every instance I could remember of David's unusual behavior during those 8 months, patterns that had seemed insignificant at the time but now appeared clearly as evidence of his secret relationship with Rebecca. There had been unexplained late nights at the office that I had attributed to his promotion and increased responsibilities. There had been business trips that seemed more frequent than usual, including several to cities where I now suspected Rebecca's company had offices. There had been a gradual emotional withdrawal that I had rationalized as stress or the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. I went through our credit card statements methodically, highlighting charges that seemed inconsistent with David's usual spending patterns or our family needs. There were restaurant charges at upscale establishments during times when he had told me he was working late at the office. There were purchases from jewelry stores and boutiques that had never resulted in gifts for me or Sophie. There were hotel charges in our own city of Charlotte, which made no sense unless David had been using those rooms for private meetings with Rebecca. The financial evidence painted a clear picture of deception and misuse of marital funds to support an emotional affair. I photographed every relevant statement and receipt, uploading the images to a secure cloud storage account that only I could access. Patricia had warned me that David might attempt to hide or destroy financial records once he realized I was pursuing divorce aggressively, so preserving evidence immediately was crucial. Beyond the financial documentation, I also began gathering evidence of my role as Sophie's primary caretaker, which would be essential for custody negotiations. I compiled Sophie's medical records, showing that I had taken her to every pediatric appointment, vaccination, and sick visit over her 4 years of life. I gathered her preschool records, which listed me as the primary contact and showed my consistent involvement in parent-teacher conferences and school events. I created a detailed log of Sophie's daily routine, documenting that I handled her morning preparation, drop-off at preschool, pick-up, evening activities, meals, and bedtime routine on virtually every weekday, with David's involvement limited primarily to weekends and occasional evenings. This documentation process was emotionally exhausting because each piece of evidence represented not just legal ammunition, but also a reminder of how one-sided our partnership had become. I had accommodated David's career advancement by taking on the vast majority of parenting responsibilities. I had supported his need for networking events and business travel by managing our household single-handedly for extended periods. I had prioritized his professional growth while putting my own career ambitions on a slower track to ensure our family life remained stable. And throughout all of that sacrifice and accommodation, David had been mentally and emotionally invested in another woman, viewing our marriage as a temporary arrangement that he had settled for until something better became available. The injustice of it fueled my determination to ensure that the divorce settlement reflected both my contributions to our marriage and the harm caused by his deception. On Thursday evening, 1 week after the devastating party, David sent me a text message requesting that we meet in person to discuss the situation. He suggested meeting at a coffee shop near our home on Saturday morning, and he offered to come to the house afterward to spend time with Sophie. The message was carefully worded to sound reasonable and cooperative, and I recognized this as a strategic move on his part to establish himself as the rational party trying to work things out while I was supposedly being unreasonable and hasty. I forwarded the message to Patricia before responding, and she called me within an hour to discuss strategy. Patricia advised that I should agree to meet David, but that I should use the meeting exclusively to inform him that all future communication should go through our attorneys. She explained that attempting to negotiate directly with David would only create opportunities for him to manipulate me emotionally or to make verbal agreements that would be difficult to enforce later. Following Patricia's guidance, I responded to David's text message with a brief agreement to meet at the coffee shop on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. I added that Sophie would not be available immediately afterward because she had a playdate scheduled, which was true and also served the purpose of establishing that David could not simply dictate when he would see his daughter without consulting me first about her existing commitments. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Charlotte beautiful, all golden sunlight and crisp air that hinted at the coming winter. I dressed carefully for the meeting with David, selecting professional attire that projected confidence and composure rather than the emotional devastation I still felt underneath my carefully constructed exterior. I needed David to see me as a formidable adversary in the legal process ahead, not as a heartbroken wife who could be persuaded to accept less than I deserved through appeals to sentimentality or shared history. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, deliberately choosing a table near the window where the meeting would be semi-public but still allow for private conversation. David arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, and I watched him enter the coffee shop and scan the room until he located me. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping well. Part of me felt a reflexive concern for his well-being, a response conditioned by 11 years of partnership, but I reminded myself firmly that his emotional state was no longer my responsibility. David ordered coffee at the counter and then joined me at the table, settling into the chair across from me with a cautious expression. He began the conversation with pleasantries about the weather and inquiries about Sophie's well-being, clearly attempting to establish a friendly tone before addressing the difficult subjects that had necessitated this meeting. I cut through the small talk with deliberate directness. I informed David that I had retained Patricia Reeves as my divorce attorney, and that he should expect to be served with divorce papers within the next few days. I explained that all future communication regarding our separation, property division, and custody arrangements should be directed through our respective attorneys, rather than through direct contact between us. I stated that I was willing to establish a reasonable visitation schedule for Sophie, but that any such schedule would need to be formalized through legal documentation, rather than informal agreements. David's expression shifted from cautious friendliness to shock, and then to defensive anger as I delivered this information in a calm, businesslike tone. He attempted to interrupt several times, but I continued speaking until I had covered all the points Patricia and I had outlined prior to the meeting. When I finally paused, David leaned forward across the table with an intensity that might have intimidated me a week earlier, but now simply reinforced my conviction that I was making the right decisions. David insisted that I was overreacting to what he characterized as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He claimed that his introduction of Rebecca at the party had been taken out of context, and that his feelings for her were nostalgic rather than current. He argued that 11 years of marriage should not be thrown away over one evening of poor word choice, and that we owed it to Sophie to try counseling before pursuing divorce. I listened to this speech without interruption, noting the patterns of manipulation and gaslighting that I had apparently been blind to throughout our marriage. David was attempting to rewrite the narrative of what had occurred, minimizing his deliberate cruelty and deception, while placing responsibility on me for supposedly overreacting. He was invoking our daughter as a weapon to guilt me into reconsidering, suggesting that pursuing divorce made me a bad mother who was prioritizing my hurt feelings over Sophie's need for an intact family. When David finally finished his appeal, I responded with a level of calm that surprised me given the anger I felt beneath the surface. I informed him that I had spoken with Rebecca and learned about the 8 months of deception during which he had removed his wedding ring, hidden his family's existence, and actively cultivated a relationship with her based on lies. I told him that I had documentation of financial expenditures that suggested he had been using marital funds to support his affair. I explained that I had comprehensive evidence of my role as Sophie's primary caretaker, and that I fully intended to seek primary physical custody with David receiving visitation rights. The color drained from David's face as I laid out the extent of my knowledge and preparation. He had clearly expected to find me still in a state of emotional shock that he could exploit through manipulation and false promises. Instead, he was confronting a woman who had spent the past week systematically building a legal case against him with the same analytical precision I brought to my professional work. David's demeanor shifted again. this time to a combination of pleading and veiled threats. He suggested that pursuing an adversarial divorce would be expensive and destructive for both of us. He hinted that he could make custody negotiations difficult if I insisted on being unreasonable. He reminded me that his income was substantially higher than mine, and that he could afford more aggressive legal representation if I forced him into a contentious battle. These threats revealed more about David's character than anything he had said or done previously. When faced with consequences for his actions, when confronted by a spouse who refused to accept blame or minimize his betrayal, his response was not remorse or accountability, but rather intimidation and financial coercion. This was not the man I had believed I married, but I was beginning to understand that this was exactly who David had always been beneath the charming exterior I had fallen in love with 12 years ago. I informed David that his attempts at intimidation would not be effective, and that I was fully prepared for a protracted legal battle if he chose that path. I suggested that his resources might be better spent on retaining his own attorney rather than threatening me. Then I stood, gathered my belongings, and left the coffee shop without looking back. I heard David call my name as I walked out, but I did not pause or turn around. That chapter of my life was closed, and I was moving forward into whatever came next with determination and clarity. Driving home from that meeting, I felt a strange sense of liberation despite the difficulty of the conversation. I had faced David directly after learning the truth about our marriage, and I had not crumbled or allowed him to manipulate me into doubting my decisions. I had stated my boundaries clearly and maintained them in the face of his various strategies. I had demonstrated to myself that I possessed the strength to navigate this process without being controlled by either residual affection for the man I thought David was or fear of the uncertain future ahead. When I arrived home, my mother was watching Sophie and asked immediately how the meeting had gone. I provided a brief summary, and my mother surprised me by expressing pride in how I had handled the situation. She admitted that she had been worried I might allow David to convince me to delay the divorce or attempt reconciliation, and she was relieved to see me standing firm in protecting both my interests and Sophie's well-being. That afternoon, while Sophie napped, I continued working through my documentation process. I had started compiling a different kind of evidence, this time focused on my own professional achievements and career trajectory. Patricia had explained that in custody and support negotiations, demonstrating my capacity to provide stable financial support for Sophie would be crucial. I gathered performance reviews from my job, documentation of my salary progression over the years, records of my retirement savings and investment accounts, and letters of recommendation from supervisors and colleagues. This review of my professional life reminded me of capabilities and achievements I had somewhat lost sight of during the years of prioritizing family stability over career advancement. I had been promoted 3 times during my 11 years at my current firm. I had managed increasingly complex portfolios and earned recognition for analytical insights that had saved clients substantial money. I had maintained professional development through continuing education courses and industry certifications, even while managing the primary responsibility for childcare and household management. I was competent, credible, and capable of providing an excellent life for my daughter without depending on David's financial support beyond what was legally required. This recognition shifted something fundamental in my perspective. I had been approaching the divorce primarily from a defensive position, protecting what I had and ensuring I received fair treatment in asset division. But I began to see that I could approach it from a position of strength, recognizing that I brought substantial value and capability to my post-divorce life. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, I sat down and wrote out what I began thinking of as my mission statement for this new phase of my life. I wrote that I would prioritize my daughter's emotional well-being above all other considerations, ensuring that she felt secure and loved throughout the family transition. I wrote that I would protect my financial interests aggressively, while remaining scrupulously honest in all documentation and negotiations. I wrote that I would maintain my professional performance and seek opportunities for career advancement that I had previously deferred. I wrote that I would cultivate relationships with people who valued and respected me, rather than settling for relationships that required me to diminish myself to maintain peace. Most importantly, I wrote that I would never again accept being someone's second choice or consolation prize, and that I would model self-respect and healthy boundaries for my daughter as she grew into womanhood. Sophie would not learn from my example that women should accept emotional crumbs and be grateful for them. She would learn instead that women deserve genuine love, mutual respect, and partnerships built on honesty rather than deception. The following Monday, I received confirmation from Patricia that David had been formally served with divorce papers. He had apparently been quite angry when receiving them, according to the process server's report, but he had accepted the documents without incident. Patricia informed me that we should expect a response from David's attorney within the required timeframe, and that once we received that response, we could begin the substantive negotiations regarding asset division, debt allocation, custody arrangements, and support obligations. I also received an email from Rebecca that week, sent in response to Patricia's request for a formal statement. Rebecca had provided a detailed written account of her interactions with David, including specific dates, locations, and content of conversations in which David had misrepresented his marital status. She had also provided copies of text messages and emails between herself and David that corroborated her timeline and demonstrated the deliberate nature of his deception. Rebecca concluded her statement by noting that she had ended all contact with David once she learned he was married, and that she was willing to testify under oath if necessary during divorce proceedings. Patricia was pleased with Rebecca's cooperation, noting that having a third-party witness to David's deception substantially strengthened our position in negotiations. While emotional infidelity was more difficult to prove than physical infidelity under North Carolina law, the documented pattern of deliberate deception and misuse of marital funds created compelling grounds for a fault-based divorce that could influence asset division and potentially alimony determinations. As the second week after the party drew to a close, I found myself settling into a new routine that did not include David's presence or participation. Sophie was adjusting to the change with resilience that both reassured and broke my heart. She asked about her father occasionally, and I arranged for David to have video calls with her several evenings per week and to see her in person on Saturday afternoons. These interactions were coordinated through brief text messages that focused exclusively on logistics without any personal content. I was sleeping better than I had in months, which surprised me given the stress and uncertainty of my situation. I realized that the absence of David's physical presence also meant the absence of the subtle emotional tension I had been living with without consciously recognizing it. I no longer had to monitor his moods or accommodate his preferences or wonder why affection felt conditional and sparse. I could simply exist in my own home without performing the role of wife for an audience that had never truly valued the performance. My work colleagues had noticed that something had changed, though I had not shared details of my personal situation with most of them. My supervisor called me into her office on Friday afternoon and asked directly if everything was all right, noting that I seemed different lately but that my work quality remained excellent. I appreciated her concern and decided to provide a brief explanation that I was going through a divorce but that it would not affect my professional performance. My supervisor, whose name was Margaret and who had always been a supportive mentor, surprised me by sharing that she had gone through a similar experience 15 years earlier. She told me that her ex-husband had also been involved with another woman, and that the discovery had been devastating. But she also told me that her post-divorce life had been fuller and more authentic than her marriage had ever been, and that she had eventually found a partner who genuinely valued and respected her. Margaret's willingness to share her own experience gave me hope that the pain I was currently experiencing would eventually transform into something more positive. As I drove home that Friday evening, 2 weeks after my world had collapsed at David's company party, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. I had gone from a woman who believed she had a stable marriage to a woman who understood she had been living a lie. I had discovered depths of strength and capability I had not known I possessed. I had begun building a legal case and a new life with the same systematic precision I brought to complex financial analysis. The road ahead remained long and uncertain. Divorce negotiations would likely be contentious and emotionally draining. Co-parenting with David would require ongoing communication and cooperation despite the betrayal and anger between us. Rebuilding my life as a single mother would present logistical and financial challenges I had not faced in over a decade. But I was ready for all of it. I had gathered my evidence, retained excellent legal counsel, secured my financial documentation, and established my boundaries. I had faced David directly without crumbling under his manipulation attempts. I had begun envisioning a future defined not by what I had lost but by what I would build. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth from the rubble of false foundations. I was not just David's wife anymore. I was Elena Martinez, a competent professional, a devoted mother, and a woman who refused to settle for anything less than genuine love and respect. That identity would carry me through whatever challenges lay ahead. The third week following the catastrophic revelation at David's company party brought the formal commencement of legal proceedings that would ultimately dissolve my 11-year marriage. Patricia Reeves called me on Monday morning to inform me that David had retained an attorney named Richard Thornton, who had a reputation in Charlotte family law circles as aggressive and particularly skilled at protecting the financial interests of high-earning husbands in divorce proceedings. Patricia's tone suggested this development was neither surprising nor particularly concerning, and she assured me that she had successfully negotiated against Richard numerous times over her career. The choice of attorney revealed something significant about David's approach to our divorce. Rather than selecting a lawyer known for facilitating amicable settlements and cooperative co-parenting arrangements, David had chosen someone whose specialty was contentious litigation and asset protection. This confirmed what I had already suspected after our coffee shop meeting. David had no intention of acknowledging his wrongdoing or negotiating fairly. He intended to use every available legal strategy to minimize his financial obligations and maximize his control over the divorce outcome. Patricia explained that Richard had filed a response to our divorce petition that contested several of our key assertions. David's legal response denied that he had engaged in any form of marital misconduct, characterized his relationship with Rebecca as purely professional networking that I had misinterpreted due to jealousy and insecurity, and argued that our marital assets should be divided equally despite my documented role as primary caretaker for Sophie. The response also included a counterclaim requesting joint physical custody with equal parenting time, which Patricia noted was almost certainly a negotiating position intended to pressure me into accepting less favorable terms rather than fighting for primary custody. Reading through the legal response David's attorney had filed made my blood boil with its brazen distortions of reality. The document painted me as an unstable, jealous spouse who had overreacted to innocent professional interactions and abandoned the marriage impulsively without attempting reconciliation. It suggested that my decision to ask David to leave our home had been emotionally abusive and had deprived him of access to his daughter without justification. The narrative bore so little resemblance to actual events that I wondered if David had simply lied to his attorney about what had occurred, or if Richard Thornton was deliberately constructing a false narrative as a litigation strategy. Patricia assured me that such tactics were standard in contentious divorce proceedings, and that we had substantial evidence to refute every claim in David's response. She had already begun drafting our reply, which would include Rebecca's detailed statement, the financial documentation showing David's misuse of marital funds, the evidence of my primary caretaker role, and affidavits from witnesses who could corroborate various aspects of our case. Patricia emphasized that the initial filings in divorce cases were often highly adversarial, and that many cases ultimately settled through negotiation, once both parties recognized the strength or weakness of their respective positions. However, Patricia also warned me to prepare for the possibility that David might escalate his tactics if he felt he was losing control of the situation. She had seen cases where spouses facing unfavorable divorce outcomes engaged in various forms of harassment, attempted to hide assets, or made false allegations of abuse or neglect to gain advantage in custody disputes. While she had no specific reason to believe David would resort to such extreme measures, she wanted me to be vigilant and to document any interactions with him that seemed inappropriate or threatening. That same week, I experienced the first instances of what would become an ongoing pattern of social fallout from the divorce. Several mutual friends whom David and I had cultivated over the years began reaching out with carefully worded messages expressing concern about our separation, and often implicitly or explicitly taking David's side in the conflict. These messages typically followed a predictable pattern of acknowledging that divorce was difficult, suggesting that there were two sides to every story, and hinting that perhaps I was being hasty or unforgiving in refusing to attempt reconciliation. One particularly painful message came from a couple, Tom and Lisa Henderson, whom we had socialized with frequently over the past 5 years. Lisa sent me a long email explaining that David had reached out to them in distress, describing how I had kicked him out of our home without warning over a misunderstanding at his work party. According to Lisa's account of David's version of events, He had innocently introduced an old college friend to colleagues, and I had interpreted this as evidence of an affair due to my own insecurities. David had apparently told the Hendersons that he was devastated by my refusal to discuss the situation rationally, and that he was worried about how the divorce would affect Sophie. Lisa's email went on to suggest that perhaps I should reconsider my decision to pursue divorce so quickly, that David seemed genuinely remorseful and confused about what he had done wrong, and that ending an 11-year marriage over what might have been a miscommunication seemed extreme. The email concluded with an offer to facilitate a conversation between David and me, if I thought that might be helpful, positioning Lisa and Tom as neutral parties who cared about both of us and wanted to help preserve our family. The presumption that I owed Lisa an explanation, or that her unsolicited mediation offer was appropriate, made me furious. I recognized that David had clearly launched a social campaign to control the narrative about our divorce, reaching out to mutual friends with a carefully constructed version of events that positioned him as the bewildered victim of my emotional instability. This was consistent with his legal strategy of denying all wrongdoing and portraying me as unreasonable. I forwarded Lisa's email to Patricia, who advised me not to respond with detailed explanations or justifications. She explained that anything I said to mutual friends would likely be reported back to David and could potentially be used against me in legal proceedings, either by taking my words out of context or by suggesting that I was disparaging David to others. Patricia drafted a brief response that I sent to Lisa, thanking her for her concern but explaining that the situation was more complex than she had been led to believe, and that I would not be discussing the details of my divorce with mutual friends. I suggested that if Lisa wanted to maintain individual friendships with both David and me, she should avoid inserting herself into our legal proceedings or attempting to mediate between us. Lisa responded with a hurt message suggesting that I was being unnecessarily cold, and that real friends should be able to discuss difficult situations openly. I did not reply to that message, recognizing that Lisa had already chosen her alliance, and that attempting to defend myself would only create more opportunities for misunderstanding and manipulation. This experience taught me an important lesson about the social dynamics of divorce. Many mutual friends would ultimately choose sides based on who reached them first with a compelling narrative, regardless of the underlying truth of the situation. However, not all of my social connections proved disappointing during this period. My friend Jennifer, who had recommended Patricia as my divorce attorney, became an invaluable source of practical and emotional support. Jennifer had been through her own difficult divorce and understood both the legal complexities and the emotional toll of the process. She called me several times each week just to check in, offering to help with childcare, grocery shopping, or any other practical needs that might be overwhelming me while I managed work, parenting, and divorce proceedings simultaneously. Jennifer also provided crucial perspective when I felt discouraged by David's legal tactics or hurt by the defection of mutual friends. She reminded me that divorce proceedings often brought out the worst in people, and that David's current behavior was revealing his true character, rather than representing some aberration caused by stress. She encouraged me to view each setback or disappointment as useful information that confirmed I was making the right decision to end a marriage with someone who clearly did not respect or value me. Another unexpected source of support came from my workplace. My supervisor, Margaret, who had shared her own divorce experience with me the previous week, quietly arranged for me to have a more flexible work schedule that would allow me to attend legal meetings and manage Sophie's needs without having to use all my accumulated vacation time. She also assigned me to a major new project that would challenge me professionally and potentially position me for another promotion within the next year. Margaret explained that she had seen too many women allow their careers to stagnate during divorce proceedings because they were overwhelmed by personal stress, and she wanted to ensure I maintained my professional momentum. This professional support proved more valuable than I had initially recognized. The challenging project gave me something to focus on beyond the divorce, allowing me to exercise my analytical skills and experience the satisfaction of professional accomplishment during a period when my personal life felt chaotic and out of control. The recognition that my supervisor believed in my capabilities enough to assign me high-profile work also bolstered my confidence and reminded me that I had an identity and value independent of my role as David's wife. 3 weeks after David had been served with divorce papers, Patricia called to inform me that we had received a settlement proposal from Richard Thornton, The proposal suggested a division of marital assets that was technically equal in dollar value, but structured in ways that heavily favored David's financial interests. David would retain his full retirement accounts and investment portfolios, which represented the majority of our liquid assets, while I would receive our home, which carried a substantial mortgage and required ongoing maintenance expenses that would strain my single income. The custody proposal suggested alternating weeks of physical custody, which would require Sophie to move between two households constantly, and which failed to recognize that I had been her primary caretaker throughout her life. The proposal offered no spousal support despite the fact that I had deferred career advancement to accommodate David's career and our family needs. The child support calculation appeared to use David's base salary, rather than his total compensation, deliberately underestimating his actual income by excluding bonuses and stock options that comprised nearly 30% of his annual earnings. Patricia characterized the proposal as insulting and a clear indication that David did not intend to negotiate in good faith. She recommended that we reject the proposal entirely rather than attempting to negotiate from it as a starting point, and that we instead present our own comprehensive settlement proposal based on what we believe to be fair and legally supportable terms. I agreed with this approach, recognizing that accepting David's framing of the negotiation would put me at a disadvantage from the outset. Over the next week, Patricia and I worked together to develop a counterproposal that reflected both my contributions to the marriage and the harm caused by David's deception. Our proposal requested that I receive primary physical custody of Sophie, with David having visitation every other weekend and one evening per week, which would provide him with meaningful parenting time while maintaining Sophie's stability in one primary home. We proposed that marital assets be divided in a manner that recognized my role in supporting David's career advancement, giving me a larger share of the liquid assets to compensate for the career opportunities one had deferred. We calculated child support using David's full compensation including bonuses and stock options, and we requested limited duration spousal support to allow me to rebuild my career trajectory over the next 3 years. Most significantly, our counterproposal included detailed evidence of David's emotional affair with Rebecca and his misuse of marital funds to support that affair. We documented approximately $15,000 in expenditures over 8 months that David had spent on restaurant meals, gifts, hotel rooms, and other expenses related to his relationship with Rebecca. We requested that this amount be considered marital waste and credited to my share of asset division, essentially requiring David to reimburse the marital estate for funds he had spent pursuing another woman while married to me. Patricia filed our counterproposal with the court and served it on Richard Thornton in early October, approximately 1 month after the company party that had exposed David's betrayal. She warned me that David would likely react angrily to our aggressive counteroffer, and that we should expect either escalated settlement demands or a decision to proceed to litigation, rather than negotiated settlement. Patricia emphasized that she was fully prepared for either outcome, and that our evidence was strong enough to perform well in court if David refused to negotiate reasonably. David's reaction to our counterproposal exceeded even Patricia's predictions of anger and escalation. 2 days after Richard Thornton received our filing, I received a text message from David that violated the agreed-upon protocol that all substantive communication should go through our attorneys. The message was lengthy and emotional, accusing me of trying to destroy him financially and deprive him of his daughter out of spite and vindictiveness. David claimed that I was rewriting history to portray him as a villain when he had been a devoted husband and father, who had made one mistake in judgment at a work party. He threatened that if I continued pursuing such unreasonable demands, he would have no choice but to fight me on every point and make the divorce as difficult and expensive as possible for both of us. I forwarded the message to Patricia without responding to David directly. Patricia immediately sent a formal letter to Richard Thornton noting that David had violated the communication protocol, and warning that any future direct contact from David would be documented as harassment, and potentially used as evidence of his inability to co-parent cooperatively. She also noted that David's threat to make the divorce difficult if I did not capitulate to his demands could be interpreted as attempted coercion, and would be brought to the court's attention if the pattern continued. The following week brought an even more concerning development. Sophie came home from her Saturday afternoon visit with David and mentioned that Daddy had introduced her to a new friend named Rebecca. According to Sophie's innocent 4-year-old recounting, Rebecca had been at Daddy's new apartment when Sophie arrived, and they had all gone to the park together. Rebecca had been very nice and had pushed Sophie on the swings and helped her feed the ducks at the pond. I felt physically ill hearing this information. David had assured me in our earlier communications that he had ended all contact with Rebecca, and that their relationship had been purely professional. Now he was apparently involving Rebecca in his parenting time with our daughter, exposing Sophie to the woman who had been the catalyst for our marriage's destruction, and doing so within weeks of our separation. The decision to introduce Sophie to Rebecca so quickly demonstrated either staggering insensitivity or deliberate provocation designed to hurt me. I immediately called Patricia, who shared my concern about this development. She explained that while David technically had the right to have other adults present during his parenting time, introducing a romantic partner to a young child so soon after separation was generally considered poor judgment and potentially harmful to the child's adjustment. Patricia said we could address this in our custody negotiations, requesting provisions that would restrict either parent from introducing romantic partners to Sophie until the divorce was finalized and sufficient time had passed for Sophie to adjust to the family transition. More troubling was the implication that David had lied about ending his relationship with Rebecca. If he was involving her in his parenting time so soon after our separation, their relationship was clearly more serious and committed than David had represented. This suggested that David had been planning a future with Rebecca even before our separation became official, and that his various claims about the relationship being innocent or over had been deliberate deceptions intended to strengthen his legal position. Patricia added this information to our growing documentation of David's misconduct and deception. She explained that while family courts were generally reluctant to restrict parents' personal relationships, a pattern of introducing unstable or inappropriate romantic partners to children could be relevant to custody determinations. If we could demonstrate that David was prioritizing his relationship with Rebecca over Sophie's emotional needs during a vulnerable transition period, it would support our argument that I should have primary custody. That evening after Sophie was in bed, I sat in my home office reviewing the mountain of documentation I had accumulated over the past month. Financial records, legal filings, email exchanges, text messages, Rebecca's statement, affidavits from witnesses, and my own detailed timeline of events. The sheer volume of evidence was simultaneously reassuring and depressing. Reassuring because it demonstrated that I had built a strong legal case supported by facts rather than emotions. Depressing because it represented the complete dissolution of what I had believed was a partnership built on mutual commitment and shared values. I thought about the woman I had been just 1 month earlier, arriving at David's company party with our daughter, believing I was attending a celebration of professional accomplishment with my supportive husband. That woman had been naive and trusting, unaware that her entire marriage was built on false premises. She had been willing to overlook small signs of discontent and emotional distance because she believed that was normal in long-term marriages. She had been grateful for whatever attention and affection David offered because she had not recognized that she deserved so much more. I was no longer that woman. The past month had forced me to develop capabilities and strengths I had not known I possessed. I had learned to advocate for myself in legal settings, to document evidence systematically, to recognize manipulation tactics and refuse to be controlled by them, to set boundaries and maintain them despite social pressure, and to envision a future defined by my own choices rather than by accommodating someone else's preferences. The transformation had been painful and was far from complete. I still had moments of grief for the marriage I had thought I had, moments of anxiety about the uncertain future, and moments of anger at the years I had wasted trying to be enough for someone who had decided from the beginning that I would never measure up. But I also had moments of clarity and strength that reminded me I was capable of navigating this difficult transition and emerging into a better life on the other side. As October progressed and the trees around Charlotte blazed with autumn color, I settled into a new rhythm that accommodated the demands of divorce proceedings alongside work and parenting responsibilities. I met with Patricia weekly to review developments in the case and plan strategy for upcoming negotiations or court appearances. I maintained detailed documentation of all expenses, all interactions with David, and all aspects of Sophie's care and routine. I participated in court-ordered mediation sessions where Patricia and I faced David and Richard Thornton across a conference table and attempted to find common ground on contentious issues. The mediation sessions were exhausting and often unproductive, with David maintaining positions that seemed designed more to punish me than to achieve fair outcomes. But they also revealed cracks in David's facade, as he struggled to justify some of his demands when challenged by the neutral mediator. His inability to explain why he deserved a larger share of assets despite his documented misconduct, or why alternating weekly custody would be better for Sophie than maintaining her established primary home with me, suggested that his positions were based more on ego and vindictiveness than on genuine belief in their merit. Through all of this, I continued to prioritize Sophie's well-being and adjustment to our new family structure. I maintained consistent routines, provided age-appropriate explanations for the changes in our lives, and ensured that she knew both her parents loved her regardless of their inability to remain married. Sophie seemed to be adjusting reasonably well, though she occasionally asked questions that broke my heart with their innocent attempts to understand why her family had changed. I was building a new life brick by brick, decision by decision, boundary by boundary. The foundation of that new life was honesty, self-respect, and refusal to settle for less than I deserved. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the divorce proceedings, I knew I had already survived the worst of the emotional devastation and emerged stronger than I had been before. That strength would carry me through whatever came next. The 5th week following the exposure of David's betrayal brought developments that fundamentally altered the trajectory of divorce proceedings and provided vindication I had not anticipated. Patricia called me on a Tuesday morning in mid-October with information that would prove pivotal in our negotiations. She had received an unexpected phone call from an attorney named Michael Brennan, who represented David's employer, and wanted to discuss matters related to our divorce case that might be of mutual interest to both his client and me. Patricia explained that she had been initially suspicious of this contact, wondering if David's company was attempting to involve itself in our personal legal matters in some inappropriate way that might benefit David. However, Michael Brennan had assured her that the company's interests were actually aligned with mine rather than with David's, and he requested a meeting to share information that would be relevant to our property division and support calculations. Patricia had agreed to the meeting after confirming that Michael Brennan was indeed a legitimate attorney representing David's employer, and that the company had valid legal reasons for involving itself in matters that intersected with our divorce. The meeting was scheduled for that Thursday afternoon at Michael Brennan's office in Uptown Charlotte. Patricia and I arrived together, and we were shown into a conference room where Michael Brennan waited along with a woman he introduced as Sarah Chan, the Human Resources Director for David's company. The presence of Human Resources leadership immediately signaled that this meeting concerned employment matters rather than purely legal maneuvering, and I felt my curiosity intensify about what information they intended to share. Michael Brennan began by explaining that David's employer had become aware of our divorce proceedings through normal channels, as David had updated his personnel file to reflect his new address and changed his emergency contact information. This administrative change had triggered a routine review of David's employment records and benefits elections, which was standard procedure when employees experienced major life changes. During this review, the Human Resources Department had discovered irregularities in David's expense reporting and time tracking that warranted further investigation. Sarah Chan took over the explanation at this point, opening a folder containing what appeared to be extensive documentation. She explained that David's position as regional sales director required frequent travel to meet with clients and attend industry conferences, and he was provided with a corporate credit card to cover legitimate business expenses. The company conducted periodic audits of expense reports to ensure compliance with corporate policies and tax regulations, but David had not been flagged for any issues in previous audits because his reports had appeared reasonable on their surface. However, the more detailed review triggered by his marital status change had revealed a pattern of questionable expenses over the past 8 months that aligned suspiciously with the timeline of his relationship with Rebecca. Sarah Chan laid out copies of credit card statements and expense reports, highlighting charges that David had submitted as client entertainment or business development expenses, but which the company's investigation had determined were actually personal expenditures unrelated to legitimate business purposes. The documentation was damning in its specificity. David had submitted expenses for upscale restaurant meals that he claimed were client dinners, but when the company contacted the supposed clients to verify the meetings as part of their investigation, several clients reported that no such dinners had occurred on the dates in question. David had charged hotel rooms in Charlotte to his corporate card, claiming he needed accommodations when weather or late meetings made driving home unsafe, but the company's review of his calendar and email communications showed no meetings scheduled on those dates that would have justified overnight stays in his own city. Most significantly, David had charged expenses for a business trip to San Francisco in August, claiming he was meeting with potential clients to expand the company's West Coast presence. However, the investigation had revealed that David had no scheduled client meetings during that trip, had not filed any trip reports or follow-up communications about business development opportunities, and had actually spent the time with Rebecca, who lived in San Francisco during her graduate school years and still had family in the area. Sarah Chen explained that the company took expense fraud extremely seriously, as it represented not only theft from the company, but also potential tax violations that could expose the organization to legal liability. The total amount of fraudulent expenses they had identified over the 8-month period was approximately $28,000, substantially more than the $15,000 in questionable personal expenses I had identified in our joint credit card statements. David had essentially been funding his emotional affair with Rebecca using his employer's money in addition to marital funds. Michael Brennan clarified that the company was sharing this information with us for several reasons. First, they believed I had a legitimate interest in knowing that marital funds had not been the only source of financing for David's affair, as this information was relevant to property division and support calculations in our divorce. Second, they wanted to ensure that I understood the company would be pursuing both termination of David's employment and potential criminal charges for expense fraud, which would significantly impact his income and ability to meet support obligations. Third, they wanted to coordinate with my legal team to ensure that any claims I might have against David for misuse of marital funds did not conflict with the company's efforts to recover the fraudulent expenses and associated damages. The information was staggering in its implications. David had not only betrayed me emotionally and lied about the nature of his relationship with Rebecca, but he had also committed fraud against his employer to finance that relationship. His moral and ethical failures extended far beyond our marriage into his professional conduct, revealing a pattern of deception and entitlement that apparently governed all aspects of his life when his desires conflicted with rules or obligations. Patricia asked detailed questions about the company's investigation process, the strength of their evidence, and their timeline for taking action against David. Michael Brennan provided comprehensive answers that demonstrated the company had been extremely thorough in documenting the fraud before deciding to move forward with termination and potential criminal prosecution. They had interviewed witnesses, obtained statements from clients, reviewed electronic communications, and consulted with forensic accountants to ensure their case was airtight before taking action that would end David's 8-year tenure with the organization. Sarah Chen added that the company's decision to terminate David was scheduled to occur the following week, pending final approval from executive leadership, which was essentially a formality at this point given the clear evidence of fraud. David would be called into a meeting with Human Resources and Security, informed of the investigation's findings, given an opportunity to respond, and then terminated immediately with security escort from the building. His final paycheck would include accrued vacation time but no severance package, as the termination was for cause based on misconduct that violated both company policy and legal standards. The meeting concluded with Michael Brennan providing Patricia with copies of all documentation the company had compiled during their investigation, which he confirmed we could use in our divorce proceedings as evidence of David's character and financial misconduct. He explained that while some of the documents contain proprietary business information, the company was willing to allow their use in family court proceedings under appropriate protective orders that would prevent public disclosure of confidential business details. Patricia and I left that meeting in a state of shock at how dramatically the situation had shifted in our favor. The evidence of David's expense fraud corroborated and exceeded the financial misconduct I had documented from our personal accounts. More significantly, David's imminent job loss would fundamentally change the financial landscape of our divorce settlement. His high income had been his primary leverage in negotiations, allowing him to threaten expensive litigation and to propose settlements that assumed his continued earning capacity would enable him to meet support obligations while maintaining his standard of living. Without his job and with the strong likelihood of criminal charges that would make finding comparable employment extremely difficult, David's negotiating position had collapsed. He would be in no position to demand equal custody arrangements that required maintaining a second household for Sophie, as he would lack the income to support such arrangements. He would be unable to threaten protracted litigation, as his resources for paying legal fees would be severely limited. Most importantly, his claims that he had been a devoted husband and father who had merely made an error in judgment at a work party would be exposed as lies by the documented pattern of fraud and deception that had characterized his professional conduct during the same period he was betraying our marriage. Patricia wasted no time in leveraging this new information. She immediately contacted Richard Thornton to schedule a meeting, and hinted that we had obtained information that would substantially impact ongoing settlement negotiations. Richard initially dismissed the request as an attempt to create artificial urgency, but Patricia insisted that the information was time-sensitive, and that it would be in David's best interest to meet before the situation deteriorated further. They agreed to meet the following Monday morning at Patricia's office. Over the weekend, I experienced a complex mixture of emotions about these developments. There was undeniable satisfaction in knowing that David would face consequences for his misconduct that extended beyond our divorce proceedings. He had behaved as though rules and obligations applied to other people but not to him, and he was about to learn that actions had consequences in both personal and professional spheres. However, I also felt a measure of concern about how David's job loss would impact Sophie's financial security and our ability to finalize divorce terms that adequately supported her needs. Patricia had anticipated this concern and had explained during our debrief after the meeting with David's employer that we would need to move quickly to secure David's retirement accounts and other assets before he could attempt to hide or dissipate them in response to his employment termination. She had already drafted emergency motions requesting that the court freeze all marital assets pending final divorce decree and prohibit either party from incurring new debts or making significant financial changes without court approval. These motions would be filed immediately after our Monday meeting with Richard Thornton, assuming that meeting did not result in a dramatically improved settlement offer that we could accept quickly to avoid further complications. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzly weather that matched my apprehensive mood about the upcoming confrontation. Patricia and I arrived at her office early to review our strategy one final time before Richard Thornton and David arrived for the scheduled meeting. Patricia emphasized that we should present the information about David's employment situation factually and dispassionately, allowing the implications to speak for themselves rather than appearing vindictive or gleeful about his professional downfall. Richard Thornton arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, but David was not with him. Richard explained that he had advised David not to attend this meeting, as discussions about settlement terms were more productive when conducted between attorneys without the emotional complications that arose when the divorcing spouses were present. Patricia accepted this explanation, though we both recognized that Richard had probably also wanted the opportunity to hear our new information and assess its implications before David's inevitable emotional reaction complicated the discussion. Patricia began by providing Richard with copies of the documentation we had received from David's employer, along with a cover letter explaining the source and nature of the information. She gave Richard several minutes to review the materials in silence, and I watched his expression shift from professional skepticism to genuine concern as he absorbed the details of David's expense fraud and the company's intention to terminate his employment and potentially pursue criminal charges. When Richard finally looked up from the documents, his demeanor had changed noticeably. The aggressive confidence that had characterized his previous communications had been replaced by a more measured, calculating assessment of his client's deteriorating position. He asked several questions about the reliability of the company's investigation and the likelihood that they would actually follow through with termination and criminal prosecution. Patricia provided straightforward answers that made clear the company's case was solid and their intent was serious. Richard then asked for a brief recess to consult with his client by phone. Patricia agreed, and Richard stepped out of the conference room to make the call. We could hear his voice through the door, though we could not distinguish specific words, and the tone suggested he was delivering unwelcome news that was being received with predictable anger and denial. The phone consultation lasted approximately 15 minutes before Richard returned to the conference room with a visibly frustrated expression. Richard explained that David was insisting the expense fraud allegations were exaggerated or based on misunderstandings, and that he had legitimate explanations for the questioned expenses that the company had not adequately considered. However, Richard also acknowledged that regardless of the merit of David's defenses against the fraud allegations, the reality was that his employment would be terminated within days, and his income would cease. This fact alone required substantial revision of the settlement positions David had been maintaining throughout negotiations. Patricia responded that we were willing to consider a revised settlement proposal that acknowledged the changed financial circumstances, but that any such proposal would need to address not only the income implications of David's job loss, but also the character and credibility implications of the fraud allegations. She noted that David's pattern of deception and ethical failures in his professional life corroborated the concerns we had raised about his fitness for equal custody and his trustworthiness in co-parenting arrangements. The negotiation that followed was more productive than any of our previous settlement discussions had been. With his primary leverage eliminated, David had no choice but to accept terms far more favorable to me than anything he had previously considered. Over the course of 3 hours, Patricia and Richard hammered out the framework for a settlement agreement that gave me primary physical custody of Sophie, with David receiving supervised visitation, until he could demonstrate stable employment and housing. The agreement allocated marital assets in a manner that recognized both my contributions to the marriage and David's misconduct, giving me approximately 60% of our liquid assets and retirement accounts in addition to our home. The child support calculation was based on David's most recent income level with provisions that would adjust the amount once he obtained new employment, and the agreement included specific language requiring David to maintain life insurance and disability coverage with Sophie as the beneficiary to protect against the risk that his reduced circumstances would impact his ability to meet support obligations. The settlement also included provisions prohibiting either parent from introducing romantic partners to Sophie until at least 6 months after the divorce was finalized and requiring both parents to attend co-parenting counseling to establish healthier communication patterns. Most significantly for my sense of vindication and justice, the settlement agreement included specific findings that David had engaged in marital misconduct through his emotional affair with Rebecca, and his misuse of both marital funds and corporate resources to pursue that affair. These findings were important not just for my emotional validation, but also because they created a factual record that would be relevant if David ever attempted to modify custody or support arrangements in the future. By claiming that the original settlement was based on temporary circumstances, rather than his fundamental character failures. By early afternoon, Patricia and Richard had drafted a preliminary settlement memorandum capturing the key terms we had negotiated. Richard took the document with him to review with David and obtain his agreement to the terms, with the understanding that we would formalize the settlement through a comprehensive marital settlement agreement and consent custody order to be filed with the court within 2 weeks. Richard's willingness to proceed so quickly with settlement, abandoning his previous aggressive litigation posture, confirmed what we already knew. David's position had become legally and financially untenable, and continuing to fight would only increase his costs without improving his outcomes. Patricia and I celebrated our successful negotiation with lunch at a nearby restaurant, though my emotions remained complicated despite the favorable settlement terms we had achieved. I felt relieved that the contentious divorce proceedings were moving toward resolution much more quickly than we had anticipated when David initially chose to hire an aggressive litigation attorney. I felt validated that the legal system had recognized David's misconduct and structured a settlement that acknowledged the harm he had caused. I felt grateful for Patricia's skill and strategic thinking that had positioned us to take full advantage of the unexpected developments regarding David's employment situation. However, I also felt a lingering sadness about how thoroughly my marriage and the man I thought I had married had been revealed as illusions. David had not simply fallen back in love with an old flame and made the difficult decision to end our marriage honestly. He had lied systematically to everyone in his life, including his employer, his wife, his lover, and apparently himself. He had committed crimes to finance his deceptions and had shown no remorse or accountability until the consequences became unavoidable. The man capable of such sustained ethical failures bore no resemblance to the person I had believed I was building a life with. That evening, after putting Sophie to bed, I sat in my living room reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in just 5 weeks. I had gone from a woman who believed she had a stable marriage and a predictable future to a woman who was finalizing a divorce and preparing to rebuild her life as a single mother. The journey had been painful and disorienting, filled with revelations that shattered my understanding of my own history and forced me to question judgments I had made throughout my adult life. But I had also discovered capabilities and strengths I had not known I possessed. I had advocated for myself in legal proceedings with a level of strategic thinking and determination that surprised me. I had maintained my professional performance and even earned a challenging new assignment despite the personal chaos consuming my energy and attention. I had protected my daughter's emotional well-being while navigating an enormously stressful family transition. I had built a support network of friends and professionals who valued and respected me. I had refused to accept being diminished or controlled by someone who had demonstrated through his actions that he had never truly valued our partnership. The settlement we had negotiated that day represented not just a legal victory, but a reclamation of my dignity and my right to be treated with honesty and respect. I had refused to settle for the inadequate terms David had initially proposed, refused to accept his false narrative about our marriage, and refused to prioritize his comfort over my legitimate interests and Sophie's needs. That refusal had required courage I had not been certain I possessed when this nightmare began 5 weeks earlier. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a cautious optimism about the future that lay ahead once the divorce was finalized. There would still be challenges, certainly. Co-parenting with David would require ongoing communication and cooperation despite the betrayal and anger between us. Adjusting to single parenthood and managing household responsibilities without a partner would be demanding. Rebuilding my social life and eventually considering whether I wanted to pursue romantic relationships again would require emotional energy I was not certain I had available. But I had proven to myself that I was capable of surviving devastating betrayal and emerging stronger on the other side. I had learned that my worth was not determined by whether someone else chose to value me, but rather by how I chose to value and protect myself. I had discovered that setting boundaries and demanding respect was not selfish or vindictive, but necessary and healthy. These lessons would serve me well regardless of what challenges lay ahead in the next chapters of my life. The week following our successful settlement negotiation brought the culmination of consequences that David had set in motion through months of deception and fraud. Patricia called me on Wednesday afternoon to inform me that David's employer had moved forward with his termination that morning, exactly as they had indicated during our meeting with their legal counsel. According to information Michael Brennan had shared with Patricia as a professional courtesy, David had been escorted from the building by security after a brief meeting with Human Resources leadership where he was presented with evidence of his expense fraud and given minimal opportunity to respond before his employment was officially ended. Michael Brennan had also indicated that the company was moving forward with a criminal complaint to the district attorney's office, providing their comprehensive investigation documentation and requesting prosecution for fraud and embezzlement. While the district attorney would make the ultimate decision about whether to file formal charges, the strength of the evidence and the dollar amount involved made prosecution highly likely. Patricia explained that if criminal charges were filed, David would face not only potential jail time, but also the creation of a permanent criminal record that would make finding employment in his field extremely difficult, even after any sentence was completed. The same day David lost his employment, I received a series of increasingly desperate text messages from him that violated our agreed-upon communication protocol. The messages began with anger and blame, accusing me of deliberately sabotaging his career by providing information about our divorce to his employer. David claimed that I had orchestrated his termination as revenge for his relationship with Rebecca, and that I was destroying not only his life, but also Sophie's financial security by eliminating his income. The accusations were absurd given that David's employer had discovered the expense fraud through their own internal investigation, triggered by routine administrative procedures. I had provided no information to his company, and had been as surprised as anyone when their legal counsel contacted Patricia with the results of their investigation. David's attempt to blame me for consequences that resulted entirely from his own fraudulent conduct demonstrated a stunning lack of accountability, and a continued refusal to acknowledge that his actions had been wrong. As the day progressed, David's text messages shifted from anger to pleading. He sent messages begging me to contact his former employer and explain that there had been misunderstandings about the expense reports, that he had made innocent mistakes rather than deliberately committing fraud, and that terminating him was an overreaction that would harm our daughter. He suggested that if I truly cared about Sophie's well-being, I would help him salvage his career rather than allowing him to be destroyed over what he characterized as minor accounting discrepancies. The manipulation inherent in these messages was transparent. David was attempting to use Sophie as leverage to pressure me into actions that would benefit him, framing his criminal conduct as something I had a responsibility to help him escape consequences for because we shared a child. The suggestion that protecting Sophie's interests required me to help David avoid accountability for fraud was not only ethically bankrupt but also logically flawed, as Sophie's long-term interests were better served by having a father who learned that unethical behavior had serious consequences than by having a father who believed he could lie and steal without repercussions. I forwarded all of David's messages to Patricia without responding to him directly. Patricia immediately sent a formal letter to Richard Thornton noting that David had violated communication protocols multiple times and was now attempting to involve me in obstructing his former employer's investigation and potential criminal prosecution. The letter warned that if David continued to contact me directly or attempted to pressure me into any actions related to his employment situation, we would seek a restraining order and would bring his conduct to the attention of the court as evidence of his inability to respect boundaries and follow agreed-upon procedures. Richard Thornton responded within hours with an apologetic message acknowledging that David's behavior was inappropriate and assuring us that he had counseled his client to cease all direct contact with me. Richard also indicated that David was facing severe financial distress as a result of losing his income and was struggling to meet even basic living expenses while also trying to retain legal representation for both the divorce proceedings and the potential criminal charges. Richard suggested that perhaps we could expedite the finalization of the divorce settlement to provide David with access to his portion of marital assets, which would at least give him some financial resources to work with during this difficult period. Patricia responded that we were happy to expedite the settlement finalization, but that doing so would require David's full cooperation in signing all necessary documents and providing required financial disclosures without delays or attempts to renegotiate terms we had already agreed upon. She noted that any attempt by David to use his current financial distress as leverage to extract more favorable terms would result in us withdrawing from the settlement negotiations and proceeding to litigation, which would take considerably longer and would likely result in even less favorable outcomes for David given the strength of our evidence regarding his misconduct. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.